All right. Hello and welcome to, I just forgot the date. It's the 21st today, I believe.
Yes.
21st of January, 2026. Our first York Civil War Roundtable of the 2026 campaign season. My name is Adam Bentz, and I am the Director of the Library and Archives at the York County History Center. We are happy to work with the York Civil War Roundtable in hosting these programs. As you are probably aware, tonight's program and our program in February will be entirely online, Zoom only, through registration through the York History Center website. So please, if you're interested in next month, obviously, if you're here, you already know how to register. So register for next month, and we'll see you at that time. Just a note that um, we are recording this program, and as we have in the past, and they will eventually be uploaded to the History Center's YouTube channel for anybody who'd like to see it again, or if you missed tonight's talk. Um, and I count 42 people. We had kind of a record registration for tonight. We'll see if we hit the top. It was somewhere in the upper 50s or close to 60, I think. So we'll see. But thank you, everyone, newcomers especially, for joining us tonight. What I'd like to do, if you can bear with me, is just get through a few upcoming events, and then I will introduce tonight's speaker. For those of you familiar, and I also would like to extend a thanks. Like I said, we're partnering with the York Civil War Roundtable tonight, which is led by Kathy Friel, Program Director, and then as we call them, the Scots. That's Scott Mingus, author par excellence, and Scott Rosenau. Both of them serve as assistant program directors for the Roundtable. And I think Scott Mingus is in attendance. I did not see Scott Rosenau out there, but I might have missed him. So let's see if I can advance my slides. There we go. All right. Again, just a few upcoming events, and then we'll get to tonight's content. These are all History Center events, starting a week from tonight, January 28th at 6:30 p.m. This is an in-person event at the York County History Center at 121 North Pershing in York, in our coffee shop on the first floor in the lobby. It's kind of a new thing that we're trying. This is part of a Coffee and Conversations program, which our visitor engagement staff is kicking off this year. And our first discussion a week from tonight is a guided group discussion, including myself. We'll be leading a group discussion of Ken Burns' The American Revolution, which actually premiered at the History Center a few months ago. This is a ticketed event, but it's only $5 for non-History Center members. So easily something, if you're interested in, that you should be able to make. But just check out our website for registering for next week. In the event that we get 18 feet of snow over the weekend, I'm not sure what it's actually going to turn out to be. The numbers constantly change, but that could affect next week, but we will reschedule the event. So, like I said, a discussion of the American Revolution documentary, and probably try to talk about some local relevance as well. So that's next Wednesday night, starting at 6:30 at the History Center. Okay, on Sunday, February 1st. I can't believe we're almost in February. February 1st at 2:30 p.m. in the afternoon, in the Wareheim Room, which is the multi-purpose room in the third floor of the History Center. The South Central Pennsylvania Genealogical Society will be back and welcoming local historians and genealogists Becky Anstein and Tina Charles, who will be discussing some of the overlooked stories of Mount Pisgah. Many of you are probably familiar. This is an historic African American cemetery in Wrightsville, right on the Susquehanna. So please come. That's 2:30 p.m. February 1st, uh, in the Wareheim Room at the History Center. And then finally, February 6th at 5:30 p.m. That is a First Friday program, Friday, February 6th. 2 hours of board game fun and adult beverages. This is a ticketed event. Again, check out our website, but I believe it's only $8 a person. So please join us for that and try to escape the winter blues. Okay, probably more important for everybody attending tonight. What are we going to do next month? So, not quite a month. I'm not sure if it's 4 weeks or 5 weeks, but anyway, it's probably 4 weeks from tonight, February 18th, 7 o'clock p.m. We will be returning on Zoom, and attorney Walter Starr will be presenting Chase and Lincoln. Salmon P. Chase served as Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury for most of the war. He capably raised the funds that enabled the North to win the war. Chase, however, had tense relationships with Lincoln and his fellow cabinet members. Starr will discuss this relationship as well as compare and contrast Lincoln and Chase's political careers before the war, when Chase was a leader of anti-slavery politics at a time when Abraham Lincoln was largely silent on slavery. So it sounds like a great topic and very relevant. February, as many people are aware, is African American History Month, so this fits in with obviously discussion of the abolition president. All right, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, James A. Hessler. I'm not sure how many times you've spoken for the roundtable. I know it's at least once with me, but several times, I believe,
Yeah,
over the
yeah.
years. Yeah, and thank you very much for coming back tonight. Tonight, James will be speaking about Gettysburg and Little Bighorn Connections, the 150th Anniversary Edition. So when I read the title today, when I put these slides together, I thought 150th anniversary, and then I realized that I'm so old that Little Bighorn is 150 years ago. See, I remember when the Civil War was 150 years ago. Uh,
Hmm.
so it's interesting how these numbers are starting to creep up on
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. It doesn't get any better from here. It just keeps going.
It's, anyway, but here we are, 250th of the United States this year. So. Um, Jim is a historian, author, and licensed battlefield guide at Gettysburg National Military Park, where he has been interpreting the battle since 2003. He is the author or co-author of four books on the Gettysburg Campaign: Sickles at Gettysburg, 2009; Pickett's Charge at Gettysburg, 2015; Gettysburg's Peach Orchard, 2019; and his most recent release, The First Day at Gettysburg, which just came out last year. His work has earned several distinguished book awards, and he has also published articles in respected outlets such as Gettysburg Magazine. Beyond his publications, Hessler co-created and hosts the popular Battle of Gettysburg podcast, reaching a global audience of history enthusiasts. He has appeared as a public historian in major media such as the History Channel, NPR, Travel Channel, PCN TV, and in programs and content development with the American Battlefield Trust. So thank you again, Jim, for being with us tonight. And if you're able to hold on to your questions, audience, you can put them into the Q&A that should be working or into the chat. And we will try to address all your questions after he's finished speaking. So I will stop my share.
Okay. And I will start my share and try that. And try that. Okay. All
Great.
right. Yeah, Adam, thanks very much for the introduction and for having me back. And I can't see who's on here tonight, but I do want to thank everybody, whether you're somebody I know or somebody who's new to the party here. I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. And if Scott Mingus, if you're out there, because I believe it was Scott's idea that I, come and give this talk. So I was telling Adam before we came on, thank God for the miracle of Zoom technology because I am seriously under the weather for the last 2 days. If this had been a live talk, I probably would have had to cancel. So I'm going to power through it. An hour, I can do this. If I do cough awkwardly once or twice, hey, folks, it's still free entertainment. So just bear with me on that. But I really feel pretty crummy tonight. But I'm happy to be here. Having said that, I got my lucky red Custer scarf on. I've got my Custer mug filled with water here to stay hydrated. And as we indicated in the intro, we're going to do a presentation I've done in the past, Gettysburg Little Bighorn Connections. And because it is 2026, believe it or not, yes, that is the 150th anniversary of the 1876 Battle of Little Bighorn. So, Gettysburg, Little Bighorn, two battles that have always been at the top of my historical interest list. I know Scott Mingus is interested in both battles. Many other people are. Of course, Gettysburg, a significant battle of the American Civil War. Battle of Little Bighorn, an iconic moment of the American West. But what's interesting is they both bookend the career, for the most part, of George Armstrong Custer. The Custer legend starts July 3rd, 1863, at East Cavalry Field, and at least the living part of the legend ends June 25th, 1876. So you have one man as a focal point in the two most famous battles ever fought in America. And people debate this all the time. Are there more Gettysburg books? Are there more Little Bighorn books? I think at last count in the bibliography, there were more than 3,000 Little Bighorn books, 7,000 articles, global history organizations, of which I'm a member, 31 movies, and Custer has been featured on TV at least 10 times, including his own TV series. And you can't say that for George Meade. I don't know that you could say that for Robert E. Lee. I'm not implying that George Custer is the most important figure to come out of this period of the American Civil War, but he certainly is, in my opinion, one of the most famous. And I always tell people I think Custer is the second most famous individual associated with the Gettysburg campaign. I say Lincoln is number one and Custer is number two. And yes, I do think Custer has greater global name recognition than even Robert E. Lee. So that's a hill I'm willing to die on. George Custer, he ends the Civil War as a brevet major general, significant role in the cavalry of the Eastern Theater from Gettysburg all the way to Appomattox, yada, yada, yada. 1866, he will be appointed lieutenant colonel of the new 7th Cavalry, which was being organized at Fort Riley, Kansas. And as lieutenant colonel of the 7th Cavalry, basically the last rank he would hold until the final day of his life. But tonight's presentation isn't really about Custer. It's about these other individuals because sometimes lost in the afterglow of the Custer meteoric story is the fact that there were other individuals who had connections to what we like to call the most famous small town in America. That would be Gettysburg. There are other individuals that have connections both to Gettysburg and Little Bighorn. And those are the guys we're going to focus on tonight. Now, I usually do this presentation for Western history groups, Little Bighorn themed groups, Custer groups. Those groups, they know Custer, they know Little Bighorn. They tend to not know as much about Gettysburg and the Civil War. So I usually reverse engineer the talk. And with those types of groups, I spend more time talking about Gettysburg. Well, because this is a Civil War group, I'm going to assume we know Gettysburg. And I'm going to spend more time tonight talking about Little Bighorn and kind of working our way backwards. But before we do that, I want to make sure, that people understand the Civil War is over. Many Union officers stay in the Army. They go out west. They fight Native Americans. It is a troubling period in American history, and it is not something that I'm here tonight to either make excuses for or to be morally outraged by. It's a simple fact that it happened. Many of the officers who went out west would be known to us as Civil War enthusiasts: Winfield Hancock, Oliver Howard, John Gibbon, who we'll see more of tonight, Ronald McKenzie. But for the American public, George Custer has really become the poster boy, the whipping boy for our treatment of Native Americans. Ronald McKenzie hasn't had 31 movies made about him. But George Custer is sort of the poster boy for our collective guilt over how we treated the American Indian. That's unfortunate, but again, that's reality of the story. So I'm going to go right to the 1876 campaign and get started on the Little Bighorn. Again, long story short, by 1876, tensions were rising with the Sioux over the inability to enforce the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. including increasing white encroachment into the sacred Black Hills, which had been guaranteed to the Sioux by treaty. And so by the late fall of 1875, Ulysses Grant and Phil Sheridan, Civil War figures, decided to issue an ultimatum, basically all Sioux in the field, kind of focusing on Sitting Bull's followers, have until January 31st, 1876 to return to their reservations or be considered hostile and subject to military action from the War Department. By most accounts, this was a pretty ridiculous proposal. It was pretty well understood by everybody that the Indians in the field were not going to receive this and be able to act on this in time during the dead of winter, but it gave military justification for the military to now take action to bring the Sioux into their reservations. And so by spring of 1876, they have put sort of a classic Phil Sheridan plan into place. They're going to put 3 columns of the Army in the field, one under John Gibbon, who we'll talk about. Gibbon will be moving along the northern boundary of the Yellowstone River. 1 column coming up from the south of Wyoming under George Crook, and 1 column coming from Dakota Territory east to west under General Alfred Terry. And it is Terry's column that includes George Custer and the 7th Cavalry. Now, one sort of comment I often hear from Custer haters is they often have this perception of Custer sort of just being this madman kind of riding around, shooting up villages and looking to massacre people. That's not true, folks. Custer's role in the 7th Cavalry in the 1876 campaign was part of a military operation, and he was in the field as part of that operation. Lieutenant colonels at that point do not make Indian policy, but he was an eager instrument of our Indian policy. Okay, so we have Terry and Custer coming in from the east, Gibbon on the north, and Crook on the south. So we have 3 Civil War figures, all. George Crook, with about 1,000 men, he's going to be defeated on June 17th at the Battle of the Rosebud, and he will be turned back, but unable to get word to either of the other 2 columns in the field. John Gibbon, he has what I always considered to be the most ridiculous assignment of the campaign. With approximately 475 men, he is supposed to patrol the Yellowstone River to keep Sioux villages under surveillance and prevent Sioux from crossing the river to get to the other side. If you've ever been out to Yellowstone River country, the idea that he could have done that with 400 plus men is ridiculous. But then again, coming from the east, Alfred Terry, little over 1,000 men, including Custer and the 7th Cavalry, which has about 600 men. Alfred Terry, hero of Fort Fisher, no Indian field experience, but he wanted Custer with him because we knew Custer was going to be energetic and would ride and fight, and that's what he does. So, our first Gettysburg connection, of course, is John Gibbon. We all know John Gibbon, Iron Brigade, commanded a division and sometimes the Second Corps at Gettysburg under Hancock. Gibbon has a couple of memorable encounters during the Gettysburg campaign. He supposedly is the recipient of a pep talk from George Meade the night before Pickett's charge. Gibbon, if Lee attacks tomorrow, it will be along your front. Gibbon was a distant cousin of Confederate General Johnson Pettigrew, but Gibbon also had several brothers in the Army of Northern Virginia, and there was a lot of family tension over John Gibbon's allegiance to the North. He did defend against Pickett's charge on July 3rd. He was wounded in the assault. A lot of people don't realize Gibbon did come back and attended the Gettysburg Address in November of 63. But by 1876, John Gibbon was a far cry from the young buck that we knew in the Civil War. He was 49 years old. He was slowed down. He was hampered by wounds. He had reverted to his regular Army rank of colonel after the Civil War, and he is colonel of the 7th U.S. Infantry, and again, command of this element along the Yellowstone River. One additional connection: the year after Little Bighorn, in 1877, he will fight with another Gettysburg general, Oliver Howard of the 11th Corps, at the Battle of Big Hole. So, again, there's sort of another Gettysburg connection there. So, where do we find Gibbon on the Gettysburg battlefield? Well, there is a monument, a Terry Jones statue dedicated to him in 1988, and we have the Gibbon tree, which is reportedly the tree under which he was wounded on Cemetery Ridge. Now, Gibbon routinely gets beaten up in the Little Bighorn literature, which I've always found fascinating because, I think we generally in the Civil War community have a very high opinion of him. But in the Little Bighorn literature, he gets beaten up pretty badly for some failings that he has in the campaign. But as I said at the outset, I think his assignment was ridiculous and unrealistic to begin with. So if we go to the map, we see again the Yellowstone River, which is sort of the northern boundary of our topic tonight. By June 22nd, after Crook had been defeated at the Rosebud, which I said earlier, Crook had been defeated and turned back. The other two columns in the field don't know that he's been defeated and turned back. But by June 22nd, the Gibbon and Terry columns have reunited, and a large Indian trail, a village trail, has been spotted along Rosebud Creek, which I am working with my cursor right now. And they come to the opinion that that village will probably turn into the Little Bighorn Valley, which was a popular destination of the Sioux tribes this time of year. So Terry and Gibbon are going to stay on the Yellowstone, but Terry is now going to let Custer and the 7th Cavalry loose. And as they're leaving, John Gibbon has one of those many iconic moments of the campaign where he reportedly says to Custer, "Now, Custer, don't be greedy. Wait for us." And with a wave of his hat, Custer reportedly says, "No, I won't." And again, we've all speculated on what exactly that all meant. But that's another kind of iconic moment in the campaign. So Custer with the 7th Cavalry, they're going to be cut loose along Rosebud Creek, kind of moving in a southwesterly direction, and then turn to the right and move north up the Little Bighorn Valley. Terry and Gibbon are going to come along the Yellowstone and move south down the Little Bighorn River Valley. I want to point out there's no specific coordination or date for these columns to rendezvous. That is a great myth, in some ways perpetuated later by Gibbon and Terry, that they had a coordinated date to meet in the Little Bighorn Valley. This is wide, vast, open countryside. We're not talking about the distance between Little Round Top and Culp's Hill. And it would have been impossible for two columns in the field to closely coordinate with each other. But they do have a general sense, as Terry wrote. It is hoped that if the Indians are on the Little Horn, they may be so nearly enclosed by the two columns that their escape will be impossible. So Custer's the south gate, Gibbon and Terry are the north door, and they're hoping to kind of corral the Indians in the Little Bighorn River Valley. By the morning of June 25th, Custer has been aggressively pursuing this trail. He is on a high promontory that we know today as the Crow's Nest, about 15 miles or so off in the distance that morning. His scouts can see what they say are signs of a large Indian village in the Little Bighorn Valley. Ironically, Custer was originally going to hold up for the rest of the day and surround the village overnight and attack on the morning of June 26th. But his scouts told him that they had been spotted by Indians and they got skittish, and they convinced him to change his plan and to attack today, midday, June 25th. And so because of that, Custer's been criticized for dividing his command and going for an attack without proper reconnaissance of the target. But again, what people have to realize, the prevailing fear was not that the enemy would stand up and fight, but the enemy would run, that the enemy would scatter. And so what you wanted to do was hit them with mobile cavalry columns. And so Custer makes a division of his command coming down from the Crow's Nest. He's going to take 5 companies with 210 men. Marcus Reno, Major Reno, will take 3 companies with 110 men and I think about 30 odd scouts or so. Captain Fred Benteen, who we all know hates Custer, with 3 companies and about 120 men. And Tom McDougal will take 170 odd men to guard and protect the slow moving pack train. So, Marcus Reno, our next connection. Now, Reno's orders, when he separates from Custer as they move into the Little Bighorn Valley, Reno receives instructions from Custer through the adjutant, Lieutenant Cook, basically to the effect of that the village is in front of you and on the jump. That means on the run. The village is on the run. We want you to Reno. We want you to attack at as rapid a gait as you deem prudent and charge, and that you will be supported by the whole outfit. Now, Reno, as fate will turn out, is wrong guy, wrong place, wrong time. He's going to move into the valley. He's going to immediately become concerned about what he sees or says he sees. Large numbers of warriors in front of him at the village. He is going to move in, and before he hits the village, he is going to dismount, form a skirmish line. Warriors are going to come out to meet him. Reno's command is routed. He's going to move back into a defensive position in the timber. And after a few minutes in the timber, he is going to lead a panicked retreat back across the Little Bighorn River and 2 bluffs on the eastern side of the river with heavy casualties. Now, while Reno was doing that, while Reno was getting routed, Custer, with his 5 companies, instead of supporting behind Reno for decisions that we can speculate on, Custer and his 5 companies instead moved northbound on the eastern side of the river. So Custer was up here when Reno was defeated and retreated back across the river. So, what is Marcus Reno's connection to Little Bighorn? Well, Reno, and I want to point out, Reno, is kind of like Dan Sickles at Gettysburg. Reno is, to many people, the real villain of the Little Bighorn story. His performance, and in many cases, people feel like he didn't perform his mission and is a significant factor in Custer's death. But in 1863, Reno was a generally highly regarded staff officer in the Army of the Potomac. And Reno had spent most of 1863 in the Harrisburg area on various administrative assignments. And while he was here, he was courting Mary Hannah Ross, who was the daughter of a wealthy family here in Harrisburg. Now, in May of 63, Reno was transferred to Chief of Staff for Brigadier General William Baldy Smith at Carlisle with the Department of Susquehanna. And that is Reno's role during the Gettysburg campaign, Chief of Staff for Baldy Smith up in Carlisle. But Reno and Mary Hannah had planned to get married in the summer of 1863, and this invasion is screwing with their wedding plans. They had planned for an early July wedding at the Pine Street Presbyterian Church in Harrisburg, which still stands today. Confederate invasion threw the city into a panic, so the bride and her family had fled to New York City. When Ewell, though, pulled back from the Susquehanna back toward Gettysburg, the immediate danger to Harrisburg was relieved. So Reno got short permission to go up to New York City to meet the wife and the in-laws and get married. And so on the morning of July 1st, 1863, while the Battle of Gettysburg is starting, Marcus Reno was getting married at the Astor House Hotel in New York City. But he then departed the city almost immediately. He said he was back with Baldy Smith that night, and Reno wrote later that he later witnessed the burning of the Carlisle barracks, which is again another one of those iconic moments in the Gettysburg campaign. Reno had several properties in the Harrisburg area, again, through the wife's family. When she died in 1874, and this is her grave in the Harrisburg Cemetery, Reno inherited a couple of family properties, one on North Front Street in Harrisburg, and also a large farm in Cumberland County. So Reno had property in our region. And I would argue that he really, as an adult, considered Harrisburg and the Cumberland County area his home. To add one more local connection to this, when he later went into the Reno Court of Inquiry for his conduct at the Battle of Little Bighorn, he hired high-powered Harrisburg attorney Lyman Gilbert to represent him. So there's another local representation, a local connection. So that's Reno. Another connection that is with Reno during this fight is Captain Miles Moylan. Moylan is an old Army officer who has really a fascinating resume. He is, as far as I know, the only American soldier that we can tie to participating in battles at Shiloh, Gettysburg, Little Bighorn, and Wounded Knee. And there are a whole lot of battles in between, but I'm kind of highlighting those four as major ones. So, that in of itself is kind of an interesting story. He was in the 2nd U.S. Cavalry, which is how he served at Shiloh, but he mustered out of that in March of 1863, moved over to the 5th U.S. Cavalry. 5th U.S. Cavalry is one of the units under Wesley Merritt out at South Cavalry Field. Now, the 5th U.S. Cavalry reported no killed, 4 wounded, 1 missing and captured for a grand total of a 1.6% casualty rate here at Gettysburg. So, hey, I didn't say they did hard fighting, but they were here. Now, in August of 63, the Captain Julius Mason, who was temporarily acting as a regimental commander, did complain of a lack of good officers. And Moylan was among the officers he listed who, quote unquote, have not done well. And this not done well is something that's going to dog Moylan throughout much of his career. After the Civil War, he moved over to the 7th Cavalry in 1866. He's not a West Pointer, so he's got to work his way up the ranks. Again, by the time Little Bighorn in 76, he's captain of Company A with Reno. And like a lot of the company commanders with Reno, there are allegations of bad performance against him in the valley and on the bluffs afterwards. Theodore Golden, who most Little Bighorn people know there's some problems with him, but Theodore Golden wrote that Moylan, quote, was not a popular officer. And in the fight at the Little Bighorn, he earned the reputation of having a streak of yellow in him that made him all the more unpopular. Well, that yellow streak must have cured itself or something because a year later at Bear Paw Mountain in 1877, he was wounded while leading a charge against the Nez Perce, and he received a Medal of Honor for that in 1894. And as I said before, he was with the 7th Cavalry up through Wounded Knee in 1890, later moved over to the 10th Cavalry, and he retired in 1893 after 35 years of service in the American military, including 26 years in the 7th Cavalry and Gettysburg and Little Bighorn. Now, this is the only local connection we're going to talk about tonight. I actually have 2 local connections, but I'm only doing one tonight in the interest of time. And another fascinating individual, this is Private Henry Brinkerhoff. And Henry Brinkerhoff was born in 1854 near Gettysburg, Strabane Township, to John and Sarah Brinkerhoff. Now, their farm was probably about less than 2 miles from where Custer was nearly killed on July 2nd at the Battle of Hunterstown, and I'll show you that in a minute. Now, anyone who's ever done research on Brinkerhoffs in the Gettysburg area knows it can get confusing. There's a lot of Brinkerhoffs around here. And so that adds to the confusion in trying to research this guy. His enlistment says he was born in Adams County, Pennsylvania. He seems to have enlisted in the 7th Cavalry at St. Louis in 1874. And to complicate the trail on this guy, for much of his time, he used an alias of Charles Harry Reynolds. But this seems to be Brinkerhoff or Reynolds's image as a younger man. Now, this is where the Brinkerhoff farm is today, and the farm would be in the foreground here. And if anybody recognizes what that is in the background, that is the power plant at Hunterstown. So, as I said, if you think about where Custer is nearly shot off his horse on July 2nd, that would be the extreme left of the image in front of the power plant. And the Brinkerhoff farm would be out here, kind of along the old Hunterstown Road. The Route 15 bypass is kind of just behind the camera for anybody who knows the area. But it's kind of ironic that a guy who would serve in Custer's last campaign would literally be living, only a couple of miles from where Custer almost got killed in his first campaign. Or did he? Because Henry Brinkerhoff is kind of like the Forrest Gump of the 7th Cavalry, and not in a good way. Henry Brinkerhoff tells a lot of stories. One account, he says he scouted for Custer here at Gettysburg. Well, maybe Custer employed a 9-year-old scout. I don't know, but it seems a little far-fetched to me. Again, we said he's also operating under an assumed name, so that's problematic. In a 1926 account, he claimed to carry a message from Reno to Terry and, quote, I'm the first man to know that Custer's command was wiped out. I encountered some of the Custer dead on my way to General Terry, and I found the old horse Comanche. So he's taking credit for like four things in that one interview there. But he doubles down in the 1930s. He says he was also the personal interpreter between Custer and Bloody Knife, and he claimed to be Reno's personal orderly on the hilltop. I'm thinking Henry Brinkerhoff has got to be a local Gettysburg guy because Gettysburg people love to talk and tell stories. And here we go with an example of that. Now, we did try to receive a Medal of Honor in 1926. Other members of the Reno Command had received medals of honor, but that attempt was unsuccessful. And Henry Brinkerhoff died in 1933 in Los Angeles. To my knowledge, he never came back to Gettysburg. It's possible that he did, but I personally haven't come across any account of that. There are some people that think he actually wasn't at the Battle of Little Bighorn at all, and that he was maybe as a Packer, for example, left behind at the Powder River Depot. Again, with this many tall tales about what he was doing, it's hard to determine. But he says in most Little Bighorn histories will at least put him on the field with Reno's command, but I would doubt he did a lot of the stuff or any of the stuff that he claimed to do. And we have still another guy with the Reno Command. This is Private John Ryan of the 28th Massachusetts in the Irish Brigade. And this is him later in life is Sergeant John Ryan in the 7th Cavalry. Of the individuals we're talking about tonight, he has had some biographical work done on him. I would encourage you to read Sandy Barnard's Campaigning with the Irish Brigade that talks about his life and career. He was at Antietam, Burnside's Bridge. Ryan said he watched a shell go through a man's leg, and I've never heard a man holler so loudly. Now, the 28th Massachusetts would have been in the Wheatfield Stony Hill area at Gettysburg, but again, there's a little bit of a complication in the story. Ryan deserted July 5th, 1863, immediately after Gettysburg. When applying for his pension in the 1880s, he explained that he had had disciplinary problems with his sergeant and he just fell out on July 4th or July 5th. So, as a side note, as the Gettysburg Licensed Battlefield Guide, when people talk about casualties, killed, wounded, missing, and captured, people will often say to me, Jim, who are the missing? Well, this is one example of the missing guys who do fall out. In his case, he said he spent the rest of the remainder of 63 mostly working on farms and then spent 3 months in the PA militia before going back to the regiment in 1864. Excuse me. So by 1876, though, he is a sergeant in Company M at Little Bighorn. And again, as we said, he is part of the Reno Battalion. Now, this is the 28th Massachusetts at Gettysburg. They did do heavy fighting here, 46% casualties, including 35 missing. Ryan might have been one of those missing. When he moved back to Massachusetts after his Army career was over, he did raise $125 towards this monument, which was dedicated in the Wheatfield, Stony Hill area in 1885. Ryan continued to have some disciplinary issues throughout his career. He would make sergeant, he would be busted down to private, he'd make sergeant again. At one point, Captain Benteen had busted him down, but then in May of 1876, before the campaign, Custer had reinstated him to sergeant. So we can imagine that Ryan was probably a little loyal to Custer for that. But Ryan does have one of these interesting moments in the fight on Reno Hill. This picture at the bottom is looking at this hump on the horizon, which is an area known as Sharpshooter Ridge, which was an area said to be used by Indian sharpshooters to fire into the entrenchments of the Reno Command on Reno Hill, which would be the foreground of the picture. So Ryan and his guys would have been about in the foreground of this picture, and they were taking fire from that hill. Well, according to Ryan, they were all in line, hunkered down, June 26th. Bullets are flying around. They're hunkered down, and a bullet struck and killed the man who was four down from him in line. And then another bullet came and hit the man who was three down from him in line. And then a bullet hit the guy who was two down in line from him. So when his turn was next, I thought, quote, I thought my turn was coming next. I jumped up with Captain French and some half a dozen members of my company, and instead of firing straight to the front as we had been doing, we wheeled to our right and put an end to that Indian, as there were no more men killed at that particular spot. And because of that moment, John Ryan did survive the Battle of Little Bighorn. As I said earlier, he went back home to Massachusetts, discharged in 1877, went back home and served out much of the rest of his life as a police officer. Okay, so now let's get to the Custer Battalion. So while Reno has been defeated down in the valley, as I said earlier, Custer has continued to move north along the east side of the Little Bighorn River with his five companies. And basically, the five companies are going to be split into what we could consider to be two squadrons. One under Miles Keogh, who is the regiment's second senior captain. Keogh is going to take his own I Company, L Company, and C Company. And then the other two companies are probably going to be split up to George Yates, the third senior captain in the regiment, his own F Company and E Company. Both of these individuals are Gettysburg veterans. And I've always, for me, again, just with my interests being what they are, I've always found this fascinating that these three men riding to their doom at Little Bighorn are all Gettysburg veterans. Miles Keogh, if there is one person in the 7th Cavalry who is studied, romanticized, dreamt about, more or equal to George Custer, it is Miles Keogh. Dashing, romantic, Irish soldier of fortune. The fanboys want to be like him. The ladies were astonished and delighted by him. And for us Gettysburg enthusiasts, of course, at the Battle of Gettysburg, he was on John Buford's staff. And here's a well-known image, which I'm sure we've all seen, but I have highlighted Keogh and Buford in this image. He had joined Buford's staff in November of 1862, and he served on staff until Buford's death. So Keogh has an interesting backstory. Again, it's one of the reasons why people are so fascinated by him. An Irish soldier of fortune. He had volunteered for a time with the Papal Army in 1860. But in 62, he sort of answered a call for volunteers and he emigrated to America to fight in our Civil War. And again, as you said, he joined Buford's staff. When Buford passed away, he then moved over to George Stoneman's staff. And again, he continued to serve in similar capacities for the remainder of the war. He was with Buford when Buford died, at his bedside when Buford died in December of 1863. Now, again, long story short, July of 1866, Keogh was promoted to captain, Company I in the 7th Cavalry, and that was the rank and the position that he held at the time of his death in 1876 at the age of 36. So he's basically the same age as George Custer. Now, Keogh has been reputed to be a hard drinker. There's some references to this in some of the literature, including some of Libby Custer's writings. Some of the Keogh fans don't like to hear this. So again, they kind of debate this a little bit, whether or not he was the hard drinking Irishman. Keogh, for his part, said that his greatest weakness was the fairer sex. He couldn't resist the ladies, and that was always his weakness. He was a lifelong bachelor, although he had a few relationships, and he reportedly carried a picture of Captain McDougal's sister at the time of his death. Now, the problem with studying staff officers is you guys know the historical record, they don't often give us a lot in terms of what these guys did and where they were. So in Keogh's case, we kind of have to live vicariously through what John Buford was doing at Gettysburg to assume Keogh would have been nearby. So we can assume Keogh was here at the Lutheran Seminary. We can assume Keogh was at Buford's headquarters at the Eagle Hotel, which many of us know is today the site of 7-Eleven. But we can assume Keogh was on these sites. Buford, in his report, did commend his staff, including Captain Keogh, who were being most efficient in bringing up troops and delivering messages. So that's what Keogh and any other good staff officer would have been doing during the Battle of Gettysburg. The other one, though, is not nearly as written about as Keogh, George Yates. And I've always had a little bit of an affinity for Yates because he's not the hard drinking, womanizing Irish soldier of fortune. Yates is just a good, solid, reliable guy. And the other thing, too, with Yates, of all the people that we're talking about here, and possibly in the 7th Cavalry, with the exception of George Custer's brother Tom, of all the people we're talking about here, Yates might have had the longest standing personal relationship with George Custer because Yates met Custer in January of 1863 while the two of them were in Monroe, Michigan, and they immediately took a liking to each other. During the spring of 63, when Custer was briefly on the staff of Alfred Pleasonton before Custer got promoted, Custer pulled some strings to get Yates brought over and also put on Pleasanton's staff. And Custer wrote Libby in May of 1863, I have induced Pleasanton to appoint Yates on his staff, so I will have him with me hereafter. Now, of course, Custer got promoted to brigadier general and moved on to bigger and better things. But because of that connection, Yates stayed with Pleasanton throughout the remainder of the war. Even then, when Pleasanton got transferred out west to Missouri, he took Yates with him. So when things, when the 7th Cavalry is formed at the end of the Civil War, and everybody's looking for new assignments, Custer pulls some strings again, and long story short, his friend George Yates is now going to be commander of Company F in the 7th Cavalry, and again, a position that he will hold until his death in 1876. And so, again, with about 210 guys, the blue line on the map here, we see Custer's advance northbound on the east side of the river. There is some evidence and generally a belief in the Little Bighorn literature that all or at least part of this battalion split off and tried to make some sort of foray down to the first river crossing that they would have encountered, which is referred to as Medicine Tail Coulee, or sometimes you'll hear it referred to as Ford B. Now, again, there's some debate over who did what, which companies made this move, and of course, nobody survived to tell us why they did it. So, again, there's speculation on it, but with Indian testimony, some accounts from the survivors of the 7th Cavalry, and limited archaeology testimony, there's a general belief that some of these guys made a move down towards the river. Here's a photo of what that would look like. I don't know how many of us have ever been out to Little Bighorn in Montana. If you have not been out there, it is vast, wide open space, and you can easily go out there and imagine a couple hundred cavalrymen getting swallowed up quickly in this vast landscape. But there's kind of a thinking among, I'd say maybe the majority of Little Bighorn buffs today that possibly Keogh's companies made a foray down to the river. Again, were they trying to cross into the village? Well, they don't seem to try to with any great force. So, what some people think is possibly maybe they're trying to pull a feint here to drive some of the warrior pressure off of Reno at this point. But for whatever reason, they don't cross into the village. And again, they continue to move north after reuniting. There's even a, I would say, growing school of thought in the Little Bighorn literature today that Keogh might have been mortally wounded down there while leading that engagement, and that might account for some of what happens to his wing. I'm not sure that I buy that, but again, that's kind of a growing and maybe increasingly popular school of thought on that today. So they reunite, they continue to move north, and eventually Custer is going to leave Keogh's three companies behind in almost what would appear to be a rearguard action, while Custer and the Yates companies are going to continue to move north. Again, what his strategy was at this point, we will never know. Some people think, and I tend to be one of them, that at this point he is waiting for the Reno and Benteen columns to come up and join him, and that these companies left behind might be sort of a rear guard to sort of open up a door for them. But unfortunately, Keogh's companies are overrun by what could be charges led by Lane Whiteman and Crazy Horse that are going to split this detachment in two. And after fierce, heavy dismounted firing, Keogh and his companies are wiped out. Here's an image of Keogh's kill site as they were coming back in following years to mark the graves and clean up the battlefield. But I also do want to make a note here too, as probably many of us know, Keogh does have sort of another level of enduring fame on all of this because his horse Comanche was found on the field, and the soldiers decided to nurse Comanche back to health and take him back with them. And he was considered the official last survivor of the Battle of Little Bighorn, or of the Custer Battalion. And Comanche's treatment and good health was sort of a pride of the regiment until he died in 1891. So we have another connection there. And by the way, a peripheral Gettysburg connection, because for some of Comanche's life, he lived at Fort Meade. So there you go. George Meade connection. Okay, but meanwhile, we said now the two companies, Yates in command with Custer in the headquarters. There's some thinking that they continued to move north beyond what is Last Stand Hill today. Might have tried once again some sort of foray or crossing down to another river ford on the north end of the valley, but for reasons we can speculate, they did not cross there either. And possibly at this point, with word that the Keogh battalion or the Keogh wing was under heavy pressure, Yates and his guys might have pulled back and ended up on what we know today as Last Stand Hill. And as the warriors used the terrain to encroach upon Custer's command, yes, it's the old military axiom to take the military crest, but you can see on this sort of landscape, they are like sitting ducks out there. The men of the Yates and Custer battalion would have been barricaded behind horses, arrows being arched in the air as the warriors creeped closer. One account said there was so much smoke and dust that it was as black as night at that point, as we had Custer's last stand. George Custer's burial site marker here in the center with the flag and the black stone, but I've highlighted Yates's burial marker. It's generally conceded that Custer was moved from his kill site at the top of the hill and buried down here, but it was said that George Yates was buried where he fell, so he would have been down here. And approximately 42 bodies and maybe as many as 39 horses were found on Last Stand Hill. And although many of the men were not identified because they had been mutilated, in some cases beyond recognition, Yates, his lieutenant, couple NCOs, and as many as 14 enlisted men from Yates's company were considered to be among this group. So clearly, Last Stand Hill is predominantly, in my opinion, George Yates's company. One officer said, "On the knoll, we found the bodies of General Custer, Colonel Cook, Tom Custer, several enlisted men, while lower down at the base of the knoll was Captain Yates and many enlisted men and horses. Yates was found not severely mutilated, clad in a blue shirt. One finger was cut off to obtain his wedding ring. Some personal belongings later turned up in various camps and trading posts. And as I said, he was said to be buried where he fell. So, as I said at the outset, I think Yates and Custer had the highest, or the longest, I should say the longest. Yates and Custer had the longest standing non-familial relationship here in the 7th Cavalry, and they are literally now next to each other, at least symbolically, in death. So, by that summer, as words start to spread throughout the country, Gettysburg, like many small towns in America, read the shocking news. And here's an August story from the Gettysburg compiler, Curly the Crow Indians story, as the people of the good citizens of Gettysburg, like the rest of the country, were shocked, appalled, and outraged to read about the so-called Custer Massacre. But I wonder, did it occur to them? Did it occur to them how many connections and how many of these people had actually passed through their town? I don't know, but it's interesting to think about. Now, the one thing I just want to point out is a couple of postscripts here. Of course, um, the 1876 battle and the death of George Custer and several of these other participants occurred only a few short years before the Veterans Memorialization era began on the Gettysburg battlefield. You know, by 1878, 2 years later, the veterans are coming back to Gettysburg and things are really kicking off in the 1880s. So if George Custer had lived, I have no doubt he would have been a frequent figure back at these Gettysburg reunions, his men here at the dedication of the Michigan Cavalry Brigade Monument. And we probably would know a lot more about what George Custer and maybe Keogh would have come, and we would know more about what John Buford did at Gettysburg. But of course, it wasn't to be. One guy, though, who did come back, and again, this image is from Barnard's campaigning with the Irish Brigade, is John Ryan. And I'm sure many of us recognize this background, the high water mark, and this is Ryan back at the 1913 50th anniversary reunion. So he did come back. And so there are a few more connections, but we're out of time. So in the interest of time, there's a couple more I'm not going to get into tonight. I think these are the major ones. And I think I cheated a little bit. I said 10 roads to Little Bighorn. I think I gave you 9 tonight. So you guys can get a partial refund on your free admission. But let's recap. George Custer killed. Miles Keogh killed. George Yates killed. I'm going to sense a theme here. Marcus Reno survived, but I put that with a question mark because I think between the accusations that were directed against him and his own drinking problems, it was a fairly rapid downhill descent for Major Reno. Miles Moylan survived. John Ryan survived. Henry Brinkerhoff survived. John Gibbons survived. Ultimately, John Gibbon, after he retired from the Army, died just down the street from us in beautiful Baltimore, Maryland. So we'll consider him kind of a semi-local guy. But I think the common theme here is that if you were with the Custer Battalion, you were going to get killed. So last but not least, what does this all mean other than connecting two of the most famous battles ever fought in North America? Is there any bigger meaning here? I think to connect these two battles in what was a disturbing and troublesome time in American history is what makes our American history so fascinating and so interesting. And as I said at the beginning of this, not here to apologize for it, not here to be outraged by it, but it is what happened. And many of these, in this case, all Northern soldiers, went from saving the Union and ending slavery to fighting Native Americans is one of the complexities of this time period. And I'll get off my soapbox here. And I think, Adam, that's it. That's it. So Again, I told y'all I feel pretty crummy tonight. I appreciate y'all hanging in, and I guess we'll take any questions.
All right, thank you very much, Jim. Fascinating details and connecting all of these men to these two battles.
Should I stop the share? Do I need to do that?
You might want to keep it up depending on if we get
Okay.
any specific questions on your presentation. And yeah, please feel free to send them into the Q&A. Okay, great. First question is from Carrie. Um, Hello, can you please briefly touch base on Miles Keogh's body? Is it correct that his body was the only one left untouched other than being stripped of his clothes? Thank you and fantastic presentation.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And you're right, I didn't mention Keogh's condition during the presentation. Yes, it seems to be true that he was untouched. He was stripped like they all were. His body seems to have been unmutilated. I wouldn't say he was the only one unmutilated because I think there probably were others that had escaped some level of mutilation, generally in the minority. But in Keogh's case, he was not mutilated. Now, one of the things they think is he had one of these papal medals, sort of a
Mm.
medallion around his neck. And one of the things that they think is perhaps that the warriors mistook that medal for, powerful medicine, and because of that, they did not scalp or mutilate the body. Keogh seems to have been found with a wound in his leg, and there seemed to be a corresponding sort of wound on Comanche. So it was thought that Keogh might have been struck in the leg while mounted. But you're correct, not mutilated.
Next question here is from Eric. Terrific, Jim. Thank you. Hope you feel better soon, and see you in Sheridan, Wyoming.
Oh,
So that's
cool.
just a thank you from Eric Norment.
Thanks, Eric.
So
See you soon.
yes. Also a thank you from Craig, and thank you from, I believe it's pronounced Ryan or Rayan. Sorry if I mispronounced that there. Here's a question I myself have been wondering about. Just this is not really like, we're talking like was it 13-ish, not quite 13 years after Gettysburg.
Wow.
So question from Lynn. Did the U.S. forces change their battle tactics after the Battle of the Little Bighorn? But if I could also just like tack on my own question, I'm just curious if there's any comparison that can be done between cavalry tactics at Gettysburg or generally Union tactics in the Civil War and what was going on at Little Bighorn.
Yeah, great questions. I mean, the way I'll answer that too is trying to compare the two battles. We think about cavalry fighting at Gettysburg. And of course, we initially think of John Buford on the morning of July 1st fighting a dismounted action to delay the Confederate advance. So John Buford, July 1st at Gettysburg, dismounts. But you also sort of have the more evolution of the Union cavalry coming into their own with more of the glamorous and dramatic saber charges, which Custer, for example, spearheads at East Cavalry Field under the command of David Gregg. So you have the mix of mounted and dismounted tactics, and I would say that is still pretty much what they're doing at Little Bighorn.
Hmm.
Now, because of the vast amount of open space on the Great Plains, as I said at the outset, you've got to stay mobile and stay on horseback because part of the thinking isn't that the Indians are going to stand up and fight, but that they're going to run and scatter, and you've got to stay mobile to keep up with them. But nevertheless, if you look at how the Army officers choose to fight at Little Bighorn, Marcus Reno dismounts. There's some indication, and again, we don't know because they were all killed, but there's some indication that a large portion of Keogh's wing was dismounted. And then, of course, when Custer and the gang get the last stand hill, they dismount. So I think the tactics are still, frankly, relatively similar enough. One additional comparison I'll make too is, the saber charges of the Civil War. There were no sabers at Little Bighorn. They tended to feel they were relatively useless in Indian fighting because, again, it was thinking you would not get close enough to have
Right.
to, slash, 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 like we would do against Wade Hampton on East Cavalry Field. So I think it's still a mix of mounted and dismounted tactics.
Excellent. Thank
But
you.
yeah, thanks, Lynn, for the question. Good question.
Okay. Um, Next question is from Janice. I have always believed that Benteen and Reno refused to assist Custer. Has that ever been investigated? And by the way, I am a cousin of Custer, and thanks for keeping his memory alive.
Oh, great, great. Well, thank you. I've met a few Custer relatives over the years, and it's always fun to encounter them out there. Yeah, was the Reno Benteen situation ever investigated? Well, of course, there was the Reno Court of Inquiry, which Major Reno called to address criticisms against his performance. And officially, the Court of Inquiry exonerated Major Reno of any shortcomings during the battle, although many people felt like it was a bit of an army whitewash and a little bit of a cover up for the honor of the regiment. And so the going beyond that, that is Reno, Benteen are probably the number one and number two topics that Little Bighorn enthusiasts still argue about and debate about to this day. So yes, it's definitely been investigated by historians. I think, well, there's times I'm not sure I know what I think, but I think as I said, I think in Reno's case, Reno was wrong guy, wrong place, wrong time. And I definitely think the whole situation down in the valley, for lack of a better word, I think Reno kind of lost his head for a while. I don't necessarily think he was drunk, as some accusers make him out to be, but I do think he lost his head and lost control. I think Benteen was overall a good, solid Army officer, and really the fact that any of the regiment survives owes it to Benteen for taking charge on Reno Hill the night of June 25th through the 26th. I think if he had not done that, they might have all been killed. But, whether or not Reno and Benteen could have and should have quickly reunited to move forward and save Custer, is one of those eternal questions that people will continue to debate forever.
All right. Thank you. Just some thank yous from Noel and Bill. Um, our next, it's more of a comment. This is a comment from Mike. Great presentation. My wife thinks you are famous since we ran into you up on Oak Ridge last year. We were out at Little Bighorn last year, and she felt really sorry for the horses and loved the horse cemetery.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
I think I've,
yeah, that I and thank you, Mike. And I'm with your wife on that. You can't help but feel bad for the horses if they were,
yeah.
if you're an animal person that they were forced into that situation. And I think it's one of the reasons why we enjoy the Comanche story, to know that at least, not only did Comanche survive, but he became a special project of the regiment for the rest of his life. But yeah, it is a sad story. I agree.
Okay, this next question is from Joseph. Why was Tom Custer near George on Last Stand Hill? Could it be that they knew they were going to die and wanted to be together? Uh, Audie Reed there as well, correct?
Yeah, yeah, there's always been a lot of speculation about the final moments of George and Tom. And again, folks, I'll keep saying it, but keep in mind we have no idea because, none of them survived to tell us. But there's always been sort of a popular, and I would dare I say romantic notion that knowing that the end was near, that maybe George was wounded because George had a chest wound. There's always sort of this romantic notion that brother Tom maybe finished George off with a head wound rather than being captured by the enemy. Again, it's very romantic. There's no evidence of that because we have no way of knowing that. Why was he with or near his brother at the end? because rather than commanding his company C, which would have been Tom Custer's normal assignment, by most accounts on June 25th, Tom was riding with the headquarters guard. And so Tom, with the rest of headquarters, Cook and the others, was in and around Last Stand Hill. So that probably explains that to the best we know about it. Again, did they know the end was near and finish each other off? It's as good of a theory as any, but we have no way of knowing.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Anita. Uh,
Oh,
Love the
Anita's here.
presentation. D'Onofrio? Anita
Yeah.
D'Onofrio?
All
Oh,
right.
okay. All right. She says, "Hi, Jimmy. All right. Loved your presentation. I've always wondered why George Yates was buried at Leavenworth and not back east. His wife could afford the body's transportation."
Yeah, I've always wondered that too, and I've never come up with a near clear answer on that. When I did the Yates thing at our Little Bighorn conference last summer, I was kind of hoping to come up with an answer on that, and I never did. So what Annie is talking about, for anybody who doesn't know, was when they came back in '77 and exhumed the officers and reburied them in the east, what is believed to be the remains of George Custer are at West Point today, but Yates, Tom Custer, the brother-in-law, Lieutenant Calhoun, and Algernon Smith were all buried at the Post Cemetery at Fort Leavenworth. And yeah, to answer your question, I'm not sure why they didn't send Yates back east, to Carlisle or something like that to be with to be closer to family. Annie, you got to dig into that and find that one out for us.
All right. Next question is from Ginny. Um, was scalping considered a trophy? I think she means to the Sioux.
Yes. Yes, it was. It was. And so, from the people we talked about tonight, it's generally well accepted that Custer was not scalped. Ironically, Yates
Hmm.
does not seem to have been scalped, or Keogh does not seem to have been scalped. But we do know that many
Hmm.
of the dead were, as we said, not only scalped, but in some cases horribly mutilated and disfigured beyond recognition.
Next, next, it's more of a comment. This is from Bill. You mentioned the vastness of Little Bighorn. Just having visited it, I was struck with the thought that this was a lonely place to die. Thanks for keeping the history and memories alive.
Thanks. And yeah, I would agree. I would agree. They feel like lonely places to die. If you've ever gone out to the
Yes.
Fetterman Massacre site as well, that's another one worth seeing. And I often have that feeling out there. What a hell of a place to die in.
All right. I think we're getting sorted to toward the end. We have a few more questions. We probably should wrap things up so Jim can get back to recovering
Yeah, I want to go to
tonight.
bed,
But
people.
but this question is from Lynn. If Custer had survived, do you think he would have been successful in his presidential aspirations?
Oh, so I'm glad you asked. There is a common perception out there that George Custer had presidential aspirations and that might have been one of the motivating factors in his performance during the 1876 campaign. There is no historical indication. There's no historical indication that George Custer had presidential aspirations. There's no historical evidence of it. Not in 1876 or at any other time. Some books have popularized that. The movie Little Bighorn or I'm sorry, Little Big Man.
Hmm.
The movie Little Big Man makes mention of that, and
Hmm.
it's a popular, invasive myth in this story. But no, there's no indication that what he did talk about doing, he had a speaking engagement lined up afterwards. So he probably would have spent a few months touring the country talking about how he had bagged Sitting Bull's village and things of that nature. And I'll just want to take that one step further because a number of years ago, I was talking to a friend and she said to me that she despised Libby Custer because
Hmm.
Libby's presidential aspirations for George pushed George to get all those men killed. And folks, there's no indication that Libby wanted George to be president either, but it's a strong, pervasive myth that just won't die.
People like to attach all this stuff, and well, it's not surprising that the man can't speak for himself. So,
Right,
he can
exactly. Not
speak
here
for
to
himself
defend
after the
themselves.
battle.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, that's a
yeah.
good point.
Um, I think we got three more questions, and then we'll probably cut off at that point if that's all right with you, Jim.
Yeah.
So this question is from Ron. Can you tell me a little about the removal of Custer's remains to West Point Cemetery by Michael Sheridan, Phil's brother?
Sure. Sure. So as we kind of alluded to earlier, in 1877, a party led by Michael Sheridan comes back to the battlefield. And so what we have to remember is that the initial burials were done very hastily. I think there's only like one shovel in the whole command or something like that. And again, the soil out there is very hard, just not conducive to deep burials. So in a lot of cases, dirt and sagebrush and whatever you could was just sort of thrown over the original bodies. George Custer got a better burial than most, as you would expect. And John Ryan, who I should point out, who we met, John Ryan said he was part of that initial burial detail. So they sort of dug a hole for Tom and George, kind of more downhill from where their bodies were initially found. So maybe a little deeper than the rest. And they kind of put a basket or two over it and kind of tried to pin it down with rocks to hope that they would not be exposed to the elements.
Hmm.
But a year goes by, and clearly none of this has worked out very well. Bones are scattered all over the battlefield. They have been scavenged by wolves, and what else. So when they come back in 1877 to take these officers back to various sites in the East, when they get to what they presume was Custer's grave, they start uh, putting the bones into the casket when they realized that the bones they thought were Custer's were actually, there was a blouse, the name on a blouse of a corporal in Yates's company, which goes back to what I said earlier. I think Yates's guys are pretty much the last stand. So they go, oh shit, we got the wrong body here. So they look around. They then decide that they think the next body we think is the right one. And by some accounts, they said there was, I think, I forget the exact account, but maybe a thigh bone. And I think they said not more than enough bones to fill a hat. But they put him in the casket. They decided this was George Custer's, and that's what went to West Point. So I think it is, I don't want to say improbable, but I think there's a high likelihood that unfortunately what is buried there at West Point next to Libby may not be
Hmm.
George. But of course, again, we
Yeah.
don't know.
Question from Joseph. What's your opinion of Save the Last Bullet for Yourself by Dr. Marquis or Marquise?
Yeah, yeah, I know the book. Um, it was one that I read when I was younger and found it fascinating. So the premise of the book, Dr. Marquis was a white doctor who went among the tribes and interviewed a lot of people. The premise of the book was that Custer's men, rather than fighting it out, saw that they were surrounded and committed mass suicide.
Hmm.
And so the what you often see is likewise some people still buy into it, and you'll see people saying, "Oh, Custer's guys all committed suicide." It's been pretty much debunked. It doesn't really jive with Indian accounts. It doesn't really jive with archaeology. You know, it's been debunked, but it was a hell of a good book. It was an interesting
Hmm.
book. It was one of the ones I read as a kid that got me into it. I would just take it more probably more in the fiction section of the local library.
All right. Well, our final question is kind of on the gritty side, but I was wondering about it too. This question is from Mike, referring back to the image that you started with, or very close to the beginning today. Did they mutilate the bodies like shown in the early picture? by cutting open the thighs, etc., and shooting arrows after the guys were dead.
Uh, yes, but it's not clear that they were done after the guys were dead. So
Right.
bodies were mutilated for a whole host of reasons. There's a
Hmm.
thinking that, if we cut off your limbs, you will now enter the next life limbless. So there's
Okay.
that aspect of it. There was anger, and I get the anger. There
Hmm.
was anger. These people had attacked our homes, and we were angry, and I get that. Um, but I think when you read some of the accounts too, and and in a lot of cases, it was the boys and the women kind of coming up after the warriors had finished things off, and it was the boys and the women in a lot of cases, kind of screwing around with the dead, so to speak.
Hmm.
So personally think in a lot of cases, a lot of these guys being shot full of arrows, in my opinion, might have been wounded guys that they were playing around with. That's my opinion. Can't really prove it, but
Right.
so yes, they did that, and so that yeah, the reason I use that picture, which by the way was not from the Little Bighorn battlefield, but it is representative of what one might expect if you were to meet death at the hands of these Native Americans, which is why the so-called saying, save that last bullet for yourself, had some validity to it. That
Right.
rather than be tortured, put a gun to your head and end it, which is also why some people think Tom Custer Mercy killed his brother George. See how I just tied
Yeah.
like three questions back together, but
Right.
that's kind of how it all ties together.
I remember many years ago, I think I saw a documentary in the History Channel. I am by no means an expert on Little Bighorn, so I admit my ignorance. But the thing that really stuck with me, um, is there is a story that Custer, like some women, some Sioux women, pierced his ears with ice picks or something along those lines because I mean the claim being that he was not listening to their laments, about their mistreatment. So I don't know if that's true, if this I mean it was on the History Channel, so I kind of take a lot of those things with a grain of salt, but
Yeah. Unfortunately, how far the History Channel has fallen these days, right? That we don't
yeah,
have
well,
to
yeah, true.
anything on the History Channel. The original story is the idea that some Cheyenne women, because we talk about the Sioux, but we
Cheyenne.
should point out
Oh,
the
okay.
Cheyenne and other tribes were in the village. Um,
Okay.
but yeah, so one of the stories was that a few years earlier, Custer had promised not to make war on the Cheyenne, and they had promised his death if he did. And so part
Okay.
of the story is that they punctured his ears with these
Mm,
sewing alls so that in the next
okay.
life he would hear better. That's the
Okay.
story. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. See, that makes much more sense to me than my badly remembered thing. But anyway,
Well, maybe
thank
that
you
was
so
on the episode of Ice Road Truckers or
it
something.
may have been. It may have been.
Yeah.
No, alls makes a lot more sense, but I'm probably misremembering after like 30 years. But thank you, Jim, very much
Thank you guys.
for sticking this out and working through your cold
That's all
to
right.
present this tonight. For what it's worth, I know I mentioned that we had a really high registration number at the beginning. But we did have a total of 54 attendees tonight, which I think is a record going back for at least many
Nice.
months, possibly years. We had numbers in the 50s and low 60s back during the COVID shutdown. So thank you for everything you did to bring in this audience, and for those of you who are still here, we hope to see you back next month.
Yeah, thanks
But
everyone. Really
yeah,
appreciate y'all coming out.
all right. Well, have a good night and a good weekend, and good luck with the snow, those of you in Pennsylvania. And thank you, Jim. And we hope to see you back.